There are moments in life when you do nothing wrong, but the whole room looks at you as if you're the problem. On that flight, a black woman simply dressed seated in her proper seat, speaking appropriately asked only one very ordinary question: why do I have to leave my seat? And within minutes, she was being labeled a security risk. No one asked any further questions. No one listened. No one stood by her side. If it were you, what would you do? Stay silent and let it pass? Or speak up, even knowing the price you might pay could be very high? The scariest thing isn't being treated unfairly. It's the moment you ask yourself, am I overreacting? Or should I just accept it like I've always done? This story isn't about revenge. It's about choice. About preserving your dignity when you have every right to be angry. If you've ever felt like you don't belong, if you've ever been judged within the first few seconds, stay with us in this story. Like, if you believe that slow stories still have power. Share if you think someone needs to hear this. And subscribe to the channel so we can get started. Westbridge Air, Flight 417, departing from Chicago to San Francisco, is scheduled to take off at 7:45 p.m. It was drizzling, not heavy enough to cause delays, but enough to make people tired and irritable. The waiting area was packed. Gray suits. Suitcases creaked on the floor. Announcements blared monotonously, almost emotionlessly. Amidst the crowd, there was a woman sitting quietly in a seat by the window. Her name is Danielle Brooks. She was in her early 42nd, dark-skinned, thin build, wearing an old dark brown wool coat, black jeans, and flat shoes. No jewelry, no designer handbags, just a canvas backpack and a laptop with a scratched corner. At first glance, you might think she's an office worker who just finished a late shift, or a single mother hurrying home. No one in that waiting room knew that. Danielle Brooks was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar logistics corporation, and she didn't want anyone to know either. Danielle dislikes being ostentatious. She's used to being listened to in boardrooms and ignored in public. That's nothing new. She used to stand in meetings where people would ask the white secretary, sitting next to her, "Could you bring some more coffee?" She was once asked to show her employee ID card in the very building where she owned the largest stake. She learned one thing very early on. Emotional reactions will only cause you to lose your advantage. So, Danielle chose to remain silent. Observe. Remember. When boarding began, Danielle lined up like everyone else. No pushing or shoving, no priority. Her boarding pass clearly stated Seat 2A, First Class. She wasn't asking for special privileges. She just wanted to sit in the seat she paid for. The first-class cabin wasn't too crowded. The soft yellow lighting was pleasant. The scent of new leather seats mingled with the aroma of hot coffee. Danielle placed her backpack in the overhead compartment and had just sat down in Seat 2A when a voice called out from behind her. "Excuse me." Female voice, high-pitched, sharp. Danielle turned around. A flight attendant stood there. Her blonde hair was neatly tied back. Her uniform was impeccable. Her smile was very faint. The name tag on her chest reads Emily Carter. "Ma'am, Emily Noe, this section is for premium passengers." Danielle paused slightly. She smiled very gently. "I know," she replied. "My seat is 2A." Emily didn't look at Danielle's face. She looked at the shoes. Then he said something very softly, but loud enough for Danielle to hear clearly. "You don't really look like someone who belongs up here." At that moment, no one screamed. No one made a fuss. Just a brief moment of silence was enough to change everything. Danielle didn't respond immediately. She put her hand in her coat pocket. No card, no wallet. She opened her phone. She gently tapped the screen. Record. Danielle Brooks is used to moments like these. It wasn't because she was weak. It was because she had lived long enough to understand a truth that was very hard to swallow. That in this world, there are times when, the more you talk, the more power you lose. When Emily Carter said, "You don't really look like someone who belongs up here," Danielle wasn't angry. Not right then. The first thing she felt was a very familiar sensation, like an old scar that someone had accidentally touched. It doesn't sting, but it's enough to remind you that it's still there. Danielle was born in Gary, Indiana, an old industrial town where abandoned steel mills outnumbered grocery stores. Her father was a long-distance truck driver. Her mother worked the night shift at the district hospital. Danielle's childhood was filled with cold dinners, homework done under the kitchen light, and her mother's repetitive words. You have to be twice as good to be recognized half as well. Danielle didn't like that saying, but she lived her life that way. She was very good at math. Too good for a black child in that neighborhood. In high school, when Danielle won first prize in the state science competition, a parent asked the teacher, "Is she an exchange student?" It wasn't out of curiosity. It was because they didn't believe it. Danielle heard that. She didn't cry. She remembered it. She received a full scholarship to the University of Michigan majoring in systems engineering. In a lecture hall of 300 people, Danielle was one of only 3 black students, and she was the only female. Once during a group presentation, the professor turned to the white male student sitting next to her and said, "You'll present the technical part." The student looked flustered. He turned to Danielle. Actually, that was her part. The professor was silent for a few seconds. Then, he nodded. No apology. Danielle learned another lesson. They don't mean any harm. They're just used to not seeing you in that spot. She graduated with honors. She got a job at a small logistics company in Detroit. For the first 3 years, Danielle was the first to arrive and the last to leave. She fixed systems that nobody wanted to touch. She optimized processes that nobody bothered to read. As the company expands, as revenue triples, and as they need someone who understands the entire system, they appointed someone else as the chief operating officer. Someone with less experience, but a good fit for the image. Danielle didn't object. She quietly wrote her resignation letter. 3 years later, that company went bankrupt. Danielle is not bankrupt. She and 2 old friends founded Brooks Integrated Systems. It started in a small rented office with 2 folding desks and an old printer. 12 years later, her company operates logistics systems for more than 40 major corporations spanning the Midwest and the West Coast of the United States. She doesn't appear on magazine covers. She doesn't give inspirational speeches on TED. Danielle hates ostentation. She believes in a good system where people are protected and responsibility comes with power. That's why she was on Westbridge Air Flight 417. Not for vacation, not for parties. This was in preparation for a board meeting the following morning regarding a deal that the press had no knowledge of. Danielle Brooks is in the process of finalizing a controlling stake in Westbridge Group, the parent company of Westbridge Air. She had read the financial reports, the internal memos, the legal compensation hidden under the heading Other Operating Expenses. Danielle knew there was a problem, but she didn't know how serious the problem was. When Emily Carter stood in front of her in first class, Danielle didn't see a flight attendant. She noticed a symptom, a very small symptom of a very big disease. Emily doesn't think so. For Emily, this was just another tiring shift. She had worked for Westbridge Air for 7 years, long enough to know who the good customers were and who the potential troublemakers were. In Emily's mind, the image of a first-class passenger was something very specific: a vest, a heavy metal watch, a confident voice. Danielle Brooks doesn't match that image. And instead of asking yourself, "Maybe I was wrong," Emily chose the easier question: why is she here? Danielle looked at Emily very intently. No anger, no defiance. It was just a glance long enough to understand that if she spoke up now, things would only go for the worst. Therefore, she remained silent. She recorded it. "Ma'am," Emily continued, her voice firm. "Can I see your boarding pass again?" Danielle handed over the phone. Emily glanced very quickly. Too quickly. Then he shook his head. This must be a system error, a simple remark, but enough to negate Danielle's entire presence. In Danielle's mind, another dialogue was taking place. Just say it. Say it all. Then what will happen? She will be seen as aggressive, called a troublemaker, labeled. Danielle had seen this scenario too many times. She recalled her father's words spoken late one night as he prepared for a long journey. You don't need to win every argument. You just need to win the arguments at the right time. Danielle took a very deep breath. "Emily," she said, her voice low and slow, "can you explain what you mean by system error?" Emily paused slightly. It wasn't because the question was difficult. It was because of the way Danielle asked it. No raising your voice. No begging. Like someone who's used to having things explained to them. First-class passengers started to take notice. A few glances were cast over. A few impatient sighs were heard. Danielle felt the pressure building like a rising tide. But she remained seated upright, her hands resting neatly on her lap. The phone in my jacket pocket is still recording. She didn't know when this would end. She only knew one thing for sure. If I don't defend the truth, no one else will. And somewhere deep within the Westbridge air system, a chain of dominoes had begun to ripple. It's just that nobody has heard the first crash yet. The first-class cabin on Westbridge Air 417 isn't large. Only 12 seats, arranged in a 2-to-2 configuration. Cream-colored leather upholstery. Warm yellow lighting designed to make everything look more expensive than it actually is. Danielle Brooks is sitting in seat 2A. Back straight, shoulders relaxed. She didn't look around. She didn't look at Emily Carter. She didn't look at the passengers who were starting to glance in her direction. But she sensed it all. That feeling is very familiar. Like when you walk into a room and know that you're being judged. It's not because you did anything wrong. It's because you were not what they expected. In seat 1C, a man in his 50s was folding up a copy of the Wall Street Journal. He was wearing a dark blue suit and a gray tie. On his wrist was a heavy, gleaming metal watch. He looked at Danielle, then at Emily, then back at Danielle. He said nothing, but his eyes spoke volumes. In the 3D seat, a blonde woman was whispering to her husband. She covered her mouth as if what she was saying was a secret, but her voice was loud enough for the person next to them to hear. "Is there a problem?" Danielle heard it. She didn't turn around. Emily Carter stood in the aisle, hands on her hips. She felt like she was being watched, and she didn't like it. Everything was perfectly clear in Emily's mind. She's in charge of this cabin. She's trained to protect the first-class experience. And if there's someone who doesn't belong here, she's the one who has to handle it. Emily didn't think she was doing anything wrong, and that is the problem. "Ma'am," Emily said, her voice slightly louder than before. "I'm going to need you to step out of this seat for a moment." Danielle turned around. Slowly, calmly. "Why?" she asked. "Just one word, but it's a very dangerous word." Emily took a deep breath. She wasn't used to being asked the same question again. "Because code op, I need to verify your ticket. This seat may have been assigned incorrectly." Danielle nodded slightly. "Sure, Konoe. But I'm happy to stay seated while you verify it." Emily frowned. "That's not how this works." A brief silence ensued, long enough for everyone in the cabin to notice. Danielle didn't argue. She didn't debate. She just kept asking questions, her voice still even. "How does it work then?" Emily felt the blood rush to her face. She didn't realize it, but from that moment on, the conversation was no longer about the chair. It has become a power struggle. "Ma'am," Emily said this time, not trying to maintain a smile. "I need you to cooperate with the crew." The word cooperate is emphasized as a warning. Danielle looked Emily straight in the eyes. "Emily," she said, using the correct name on the name tag. "I'm cooperating. I'm just asking for clarity." The way Danielle spoke annoyed Emily. It's not about the words. It's about the attitude. Fearless. No begging. Like someone who's used to having things explained to them. At the front of the compartment, another passenger let out a very noticeable sigh. "Can we get this sorted?" he said loudly. "We're all waiting." Danielle heard it. She felt a familiar wave of pressure. It's as if my very existence is bothering other people. Emily turned to the man, giving him a quick smile. "Of course, sir. We're handling it." Then she turned back to Danielle. The smile had vanished. "Ma'am, please stand up." Danielle looked down at her hands. Long, slender fingers, hands that had signed hundreds of contracts, hands that had shaken hands with the most powerful people in the industry. She felt her heart slow down. This is the moment years ago when Danielle would have stood up, would have followed through, would have stepped aside to let things go smoothly. But today, she didn't get up. "Emily Danielle Noe Jeong Thup Hone. I paid for this seat. I have a valid boarding pass. I'm not refusing to cooperate. I'm refusing to be displaced without explanation." The word displaced echoed in the cabin like a low note. Emily paused for half a second. Then she turned around and pressed the internal call button. "Captain," she said into the intercom. "I have a passenger in first class refusing to comply." The word refrigerating fell into the compartment like a stone. Danielle felt a few sharp gazes. A few bodies leaned forward. She knew what was about to happen, and she also knew she wasn't allowed to react incorrectly. In her jacket pocket, Danielle's phone vibrated very softly, still recording. She didn't touch it. She just sat there, breathing evenly, observing. Emily straightened her back, like someone who had just called for reinforcements. "Please remain seated," she said, her voice now commanding. "The captain will be here shortly." Danielle nodded. "Thank you," she said. Two simple words. But they only confused Emily more. The first-class cabin became strangely silent. No one spoke anymore. No one flipped through the newspaper. No one looked at their phone. Everyone is waiting. Let's wait and see. Who will win? Danielle looked out the window. Outside, a light rain continued to fall on the aircraft. The raindrops slid along the plane, their path blurred by the airport lights. She recalled a distant evening when she was a young girl standing in front of the Human Resources office, denied a promotion without any clear reason. She stood there for a long time, not crying, not screaming. "I only told myself one thing. I won't stay in places that don't want me to exist." Danielle has no intention of leaving this flight today. It's not about the position. It's not about the money. But because of a boundary. And when the heavy footsteps echoed from the cockpit, Danielle knew that that boundary is about to be tested once again. The footsteps from the cockpit were unhurried, heavy, steady, rhythmic. Danielle Brooks knew who it was without turning around. Some people enter a space physically, and some people enter through authority. The person approaching the first-class compartment belongs to the second category. Captain Richard Halverson appeared at the end of the aisle. He was nearly 60 years old, broad-shouldered. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed. His uniform was immaculate, with 4 gold stripes on his epaulets. He's the kind of person who's used to people doing things before asking why. Richard glanced quickly across the compartment. A single glance was enough to read the atmosphere. Silence, waiting eyes, and Danielle Brooks sitting upright in seat 2A. Captain Emily Carter said quickly, her voice tinged with relief. "She's refusing to comply." The word "she" is emphasized very clearly, like an exclamation mark. Richard nodded. He didn't ask any further questions. He didn't look at Danielle immediately. He stood beside Emily, his hands clasped behind his back, the posture of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Ma'am," Richard said, finally turning to Danielle. "Is there a problem here?" His voice was low, calm, but he didn't seem to be listening. Danielle looked up. Her eyes met his. "Yes," she replied. "There is." Just 2 words, but enough to make a few passengers take a quiet breath. Richard raised his eyebrows. "I'm told you're refusing crew instructions." Danielle shook her head very slightly. "No, Captain Konoe. I'm asking for an explanation before being removed from a seat I paid for." Richard was silent for a second. A second is a very short time, but in that second a decision was made. Federal aviation regulations require passengers to comply with crew instructions only. If you do not comply, you may be removed from the aircraft. He said that sentence smoothly, as if he'd said it 100 times. Danielle listened, and she listened very clearly. But she also heard things he didn't say. He didn't ask if her ticket was valid. He didn't request a system check. He didn't ask why there was an error. He just looked at her and concluded. "Captain Danielle Noe Jeong Vunde. I am complying. I'm seated. I'm calm. I'm not disruptive. I'm asking why my valid ticket is being questioned." Richard looked at her a little longer. In those eyes, Danielle saw something familiar. Not anger, not hostility. Rather, it's the discomfort of having familiar order challenged. The man in the suit seated in seat 1C spoke up. "Captain, we're all just trying to get home, Ong Ta Noi. This is first class. There shouldn't be this kind of issue." Richard nodded as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Exactly," he said. Then, he turned back to Danielle. "Ma'am, I need you to stand up and step aside while we resolve this." Danielle felt a chill run down her spine. This is the moment. The moment when things can spiral out of control. She knew that if she stood up now, she would never return to this seat. And it's not just about a seat. It's about who has the right to tell whom to stand up. Danielle placed both feet firmly on the floor. She looked directly at Richard. "I'm not standing, Konoe, because I have not been given a valid reason." The first-class cabin felt like it had frozen over. Emily turned to Richard, her eyes wide. Captain Richard raised his hand, signaling Emily to be quiet. "Ma'am," he said, his voice lowered. "Are you refusing a direct order from the captain?" The term direct order fell like a hammer blow. Danielle didn't answer immediately. She looked down, not out of fear, but because she's choosing words. In Danielle's mind, another struggle was taking place. I can stand up. This is the end of it. I'll go back to the hotel, get some sleep, and sign the contract tomorrow anyway. But then what? What about the others? She thought of the complaint reports she had read. The quiet settlements. The swallowed-up stories. Danielle lifted her head. No, Konoi. I'm refusing to be treated unfairly. A few whispers could be heard. Emily took a half step back. She was beginning to feel that things weren't going according to plan. Richard, however, did not. He let out a long sigh, like someone who had just run out of patience. Ma'am, he said, this time no longer trying to remain neutral. If you do not stand up right now, I will have you removed from this aircraft. Danielle felt her heart beating faster, but her voice remained calm. On what grounds? Richard looked at her. And then, he smiled. A very small smile. Very cold. Non-compliance, noi, and potential security risk. The word security risk completely changed the atmosphere in the cabin. Some people sat up straight. Some people glanced at Danielle with a different look in their eyes. Danielle realized that immediately. That's when she knew things had crossed the line. Captain Konoi Chum Rai. I want to be very clear. I am not a security risk. I am seated. I am not threatening anyone. And I am recording this interaction. Emily froze. Richard frowned. You're recording? He asked. Yes, Danielle dapped. For my own protection. A moment of silence fell over the cabin. Short, but heavy. Richard didn't like it. He didn't like being filmed. It wasn't because he knew he was wrong. It was because he wasn't used to being observed. Ma'am, he said, his voice turning cold. Recording a crew without consent is inappropriate. Danielle shook her head. I'm in a public space, Konoi, and I have the right to document what's happening to me. Richard clenched his jaw. He turned to Emily. Call ground security. Emily nodded immediately, as if she had been waiting for that order from the start. Danielle heard the crackling of the walkie-talkie. Short words. Urgent. The first-class cabin became noisier. It wasn't because of the voices. It was because of the spreading tension. Danielle looked around. The faces that had been indifferent just minutes before were now filled with curiosity and a little fear. Don't be afraid of her. But I'm afraid of the disruption. Danielle leaned back in her chair. She took a deep breath. The phone in my jacket pocket is still recording. She didn't know how far this would go. But she knew one thing for sure. When they call you a threat, the truth becomes your only weapon. And in the first-class cabin of Westbridge, Air 417, that truth is being recorded every second. The first-class cabin was no longer quiet. It wasn't because of the arguing. It was because very small movements began to appear. One person adjusts their seatbelt. Another glances at their watch. Someone sighs loud enough for the person next to them to hear. Danielle Brooks felt it all. She remained seated. Seat 2A. Back straight. Hands resting on her thighs. She didn't move. Not out of stubbornness, but because she understood. If she stood up now, the story would be written for her. Richard Halverson turned and walked a few steps down the narrow corridor. He spoke loud enough for everyone in the cabin to hear. We have a situation that's delaying departure. No names were mentioned. No faces were shown, but all eyes were on Danielle. Emily Carter stood close beside him, her hand gripping the walkie-talkie tightly. She felt her heart racing. She didn't think things would go this far. In Emily's mind, this should have been a simple matter, a system error, a passenger misunderstood. But now that the captain is here and the word security risk has been spoken, things are no longer so simple. Ground security is on the way, Emily whispered to Richard. Richard nodded. Without turning around, Danielle heard it. She didn't seem surprised. She had anticipated this. In that moment, Danielle thought about the meeting tomorrow. A large room, a long table, people talking about core values, customer experience, and a culture of respect. She thought about the numbers, the growth charts, and the hidden compensation payments. I'm seeing things that the numbers can't tell me. Ma'am, Richard said, turning to face Danielle. For the last time, will you comply and step out of the seat? Danielle looked up. She looked him straight in the eye. Captain Ko Dap Jeong Trum Va Chum. I am seated. I am calm. I am not interfering with the flight. Please explain why my seat is being taken. Richard let out a sigh, a very distinct breath. Because Ong Noi, we have reason to believe this seat was improperly assigned. Danielle tilted her head very slightly. What reason? She asked. Richard didn't answer immediately. He turned to Emily. Didn't you say this seat was reserved, Ong Hoi? Emily nodded quickly. Yes, Captain. It's typically reserved for, she hesitated, for our top-tier guests. Danielle subtly curved her lips into a slight smile. It wasn't laughter. It was just a very slight reflex. Typically, she repeated. Doesn't mean always. That remark caused a few passengers to exchange glances. It's not about the content, it's about who says it. Richard felt control slipping from his grasp. He wasn't used to being questioned so intensely, especially by a passenger he had unconsciously categorized as easy to deal with. Ma'am, he said, his voice now firm. You're becoming disruptive. Danielle frowned. By asking questions, Kohoi. In seat 1C, the man in the suit spoke up again. This is ridiculous, Ong Ta Noi. Captain, if she won't move, maybe she shouldn't be on the flight. A very short statement. But it opens a very dangerous door. Danielle turned her head towards the man. No anger, no defiance. Just look. Sir, she said, her voice even. I haven't done anything to you. The man paused for a moment. Then he turned away. Richard raised his hand. That's enough, Ong Noi. Ma'am, I'm going to have you escorted off the aircraft. At that moment, there was no screaming. Only one very distinct sensation spread throughout the cavity. Everything has been decided. Danielle took a deep breath. She felt a familiar pressure on her chest, not fear, but exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who has had to explain too many times things that don't need explaining. Captain, she said, her voice still calm. I want to state for the record that I am being removed without cause. Richard did not answer. He turned away, gesturing to Emily. Open the aisle, he said. Emily nodded, swallowing hard. She stepped forward, gesturing for the passengers standing nearby to step back. Danielle sensed the space around her changing. It's no longer just a chair. It's a hot spot. Two ground security personnel appeared at the hatch. They wore dark blue uniforms. They were large in stature. Their expressions were neutral. Richard took a step forward. This passenger is refusing to comply with crew instructions, Ong Noi. She needs to be removed. One of the two employees looked at Danielle. Ma'am, he said, his voice low. Can you come with us? Danielle looked at him. Then she looked at Richard. Then she looked at Emily. She knew she was being watched from all sides. The phone in my jacket pocket is still recording. I will walk, Danielle Noi. But I am not resisting. The security guard nodded. Okay, he said. Danielle placed her hand on the armrest of the chair. She stood up. The moment she stood up, a few passengers breathed a sigh of relief. It's like order has just been restored. Danielle stepped out into the hallway. Emily avoided her gaze. Richard stood straight, saying nothing. Danielle walked past seat 1C. The man in the suit looked down at his newspaper as if it were all over. As Danielle stepped through the cabin curtain, a very strange feeling arose. Not humiliating, not angry. It's about clarity. That what she is going through is not a personal incident. It is a pattern. Outside the cabin above the duct bridge, the air is colder. Danielle paused for a second. She turned her head and looked inside. She saw Emily standing there. Her face was tense, and in her eyes, a very slight flicker of suspicion. But Emily said nothing. Danielle turned away. She didn't know how far this would go, but she knew that from this moment on the truth had been recorded. And once the truth exists, it will find its way. The jet bridge, leading from the airplane cabin to the ground, was longer than Danielle remembered. It wasn't because of the distance. It was because each step echoed so clearly. The sound of her shoes hitting the metal floor. The cold wind whistling through the cracks in the door. And behind her, the first-class cabin curtains closing. Nobody said anything, needless to say. Danielle Brooks walked between two security officers. They didn't drag her. They didn't handcuff her. They just walked on either side close enough to remind her that she no longer had a choice. She kept her back straight, her shoulders relaxed, as if she were walking through the lobby of her own office. But inside something is cracking. When they reached the end of the tubular bridge, the metal doors closed behind them. That sound was very distinct. Like a period. Danielle stopped. "Ma'am," a security guard said in a neutral voice. "We're going to need you to come with us." Danielle nodded. "Where?" she asked. "Just to a holding area in HTADAP. Until we sort this out." Sort this out? That phrase echoed in Danielle's head, sounding both vague and chilling. She followed them through the gray concrete corridors, through doors without nameplates, through an area that ordinary passengers would never see. The security waiting area was small. The white fluorescent lights were harsh. There was a metal table and 3 plastic chairs. Danielle was invited to sit down. No one asked her name. No one asked what had happened. Just wait. When the door closed, silence descended. No more scrutinizing glances. No more commanding voices. Only Danielle remains, and the sound of my own heartbeat. She put her backpack down on the floor. She sat down on the chair. Her hand trembled slightly. It wasn't because of fear. It was because the pent-up emotions had finally found a way to be released. Danielle closed her eyes. Is it going to stay like this? Is it going to stay like this forever? She was used to being strong, used to being the sensible one, used to not making a big deal out of it. But as she sat in this small room, Danielle realized something very painful. That, no matter how far you go, how successful you become, how many systems you control, just one wrong label can ruin everything. She recalled the moment she stood up from seat 2A. The way some passengers breathed a sigh of relief. The way their eyes turned away. No one asked her if she was okay. No one questioned whether this was fair. They only saw their flight resume. Danielle opened her phone. The screen displays. Recording saved. She looked at the file length. 23 minutes. 23 minutes of speech. Carefully chosen words. Stickers applied quickly. Non-compliance. Security risk. She played the recording again. Not to listen to it again, but to confirm that it was real. That she wasn't imagining things. That she wasn't being overly sensitive. That this had actually happened. There was a knock on the door. Danielle lifted her head. Another security guard walked in. He was younger. He looked a little flustered. "Ma'am, Ann Noy, we need to take your statement." Danielle nodded. "Of course." He took out a notebook. He sat opposite me. "Can you tell me what happened?" Danielle recounted. No emotion, no embellishment, just the facts. She spoke slowly, clearly. When she mentioned the word recording, he looked up. "You recorded it, Ain Hawi." "Yes," Danielle Dapp. "For my own safety." He nodded. "Take notes." "Captain Halverson said you were uncooperative," he continued. Danielle smiled very slightly. "I was cooperative, Konoe. I was calm. I just didn't agree to be removed without explanation." He stopped writing. "Look at her." Then he bent down and continued writing. When he left, Danielle was alone again. She looked at her watch. Westbridge Air Flight 417 was supposed to have taken off. She pictured first class right now. C2A is empty, or someone else is sitting there. Emily Carter is probably breathing a sigh of relief. Richard Halverson is probably checking his checklist. Life goes on. A very strange feeling welled up inside Danielle. Not sad, not angry. It's about being alert. That this wasn't a coincidence. That it wasn't just about her. It's about how a system reacts when challenged. Danielle leaned back in her chair. She thought about tomorrow's deal, about the board meeting, about the people who had believed in her. Should I call them? Should I let them know beforehand? She picked up the phone. Then she put it down. Not yet. Danielle has always believed that power doesn't lie in reacting immediately. It is located at that time. And now, all she needs to do is wait. An hour has passed. Then it was 2 o'clock. No one came. Danielle was given a glass of water. A vague apology. Just procedure, people say. Procedure. A very convenient word. When an airport manager finally appeared, he spoke in a very cautious tone. "Miss Brooks," he said, "you're free to go." Danielle stood up. "Am I charged with anything, Holy?" He shook his head. "No." "Am I banned from the airline?" she asked again. He hesitated. Then he shook his head. "No." Danielle nodded. She slung her backpack over her shoulder. As she stepped out of the security area, she paused for a second. "Turn your head and look at that small room." She knew she would never forget this place. Not because of the pain, but because of the clarity it brings. Outside, the rain has stopped. The wet runway reflected the lights, sparkling like a shattered mirror. Danielle stood there, alone, and in that very quiet moment, she made a decision. This is not a decision made by a victim. It is a decision made by someone who is responsible. This story won't end here. The night in Chicago was colder than Danielle Brooks had imagined. It's not the cold of the weather. It's the cold of the emptiness. She stood in front of the large glass windows of the station, watching the taxis lined up waiting for passengers. The headlights shone on the rain-soaked pavement, reflecting long, hazy streaks of light. Westbridge Air Flight 417 must now be somewhere in the sky heading west. Danielle is no longer there. She pulled up the collar of her coat. Stand still. There are moments in life when you don't know whether to move forward or turn back, and you realize none of the options are easy. Danielle hailed a taxi. The driver was a middle-aged man with a deep, distinctly Chicago accent. "Where to?" he asked. Danielle gave the hotel address. A small hotel near the city center, not too fancy. She doesn't need to be fancy. She needs peace and quiet. The car started moving. The rain pattered against the windshield. The radio played an old jazz tune, soft, slow. Danielle leaned her head against the window. In the reflection in the glass, she saw her own face. "Don't get angry, don't panic. I'm just tired. Did I overreact?" That question came up very naturally, like a reflex honed over a long period. I can get back on my feet. I can avoid all of this. Danielle closed her eyes. She hated that question, not because it's wrong, but because it's frighteningly familiar. She recalled previous occasions. The time she remained silent in a meeting room when someone else took credit for her idea. The time she smiled when she was mistakenly called an assistant. The time she told herself it's not worth making a big deal out of. Each time Danielle chose to move on. And she went very far. But tonight, sitting in the taxi, driving through familiar streets, Danielle wondered, what's the point of traveling far if you still have to bow your head to what's wrong? The taxi stopped in front of the hotel. Danielle paid. "Thank you." She dragged her suitcase through the lobby. Received the keys. No words. Her room was on the 12th floor. It overlooked the Chicago River. She switched on the light. The room was small, tidy. Danielle put her backpack down. She took off her coat. She sat down on the edge of the bed, silent. She took out her phone. There are 3 missed messages. From Marcus Reed. Marcus is the chief financial officer of Brooks Integrated Systems. He has worked with Danielle for almost 10 years. "Danielle, is everything all right? We need to confirm the meeting schedule for tomorrow morning. Call me when you're free." Danielle stared at those words for a long time. She hasn't answered yet. She played the recording again, not to listen to the whole thing, but to listen to your own voice. Her voice in the recording wasn't shaky, not high-pitched, not defensive, just someone asking reasonable questions. Danielle paused the recording where Richard Halverson says security risk. She closed her eyes. That phrase echoed in my head, cold and sharp. What makes them say it so easily? And what makes me accept it? Danielle put the phone down. She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the river flows slowly. The bridges are brightly lit. Chicago at night is beautiful. A quiet beauty, unpretentious. Just like Danielle, she was thinking about a deal with Westbridge Group. She had read hundreds of pages of documents. She had seen the numbers. She had assessed the risks. But she never thought she would see that risk in this way. Danielle sat down at the small table by the window. She opened her laptop, not for work, for writing. She opened a blank file. No title. She started typing. Not a report, not an email. Just my thoughts. If I let this go, if I ignore this. She stopped. Erase. Type it again. If I let this go, it doesn't end here. Danielle wrote about what happened. Without emotion, without embellishment. It's just an event. She writes to organize things in her head. And when she typed the line, "This wasn't about a seat," she paused for a long time. Danielle realized that very clearly. This was never about seat 2A or first-class tickets. It's about who is automatically considered to belong and who has to prove it. She closed her laptop. Expiratory. A decision is taking shape. Slowly, but surely. Danielle picked up the phone. This time she called. The bell rang twice. Danielle. Marcus Reed answered the phone, his voice anxious. finally called. Are you okay? Danielle was silent for a second. I'm okay, she said, but we have a situation. She recounted it, briefly, clearly. Marcus didn't interrupt. When Danielle mentioned the recording, Marcus took a very slight breath. Do you still have it in Hawaii? Yes, Danielle dapped. And I have the boarding pass. Everything. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Danielle, Marcus Noichumre. You know what this means, right? Danielle nodded, even though he couldn't see her. Yes, she said. I do. Marcus exhaled. Then we need to be careful. Strategic, not emotional. Danielle smiled very slightly. I know Konoi. That's why I'm calling you. They talked for a few more minutes. About the meeting tomorrow morning. About the schedule. When the call ended, Danielle felt a little lighter. Not because the problem has been solved, but because she is no longer alone. Danielle went back to bed. Lie down. She looked up at the ceiling. In her mind, a saying of her mother echoed. Very old. Very familiar. You don't need to win all the time, but you must know when not to back down. Danielle closed her eyes. That night, she didn't sleep soundly, but she slept enough to know that when the sun rose, she would no longer be the passive one. Mornings in Chicago arrived very early. It wasn't because of the sun. It was because Danielle Brooks couldn't sleep any longer. She woke up at 5:12 a.m. before her alarm clock even rang. The room was still dark. The city outside hadn't fully woken up yet. Danielle lay still for a few more seconds, listening to the gentle hum of the air conditioner and the occasional sound of traffic below. This was a very familiar moment for her. The moment before a big decision. Danielle sat up, poured a glass of water, sipped slowly. She wasn't in a hurry to check her email. She wasn't in a hurry to open the news. She knew that if she opened it, she would find what she had anticipated. She opened her phone. Social media has started talking. A short, blurry video captured the moment she stood up from seat 2A and followed security. Face unclear. Sound unclear. Title only passenger removed from first class after refusing to move. Danielle stared at the words for a long time. There is no word distinguish. There is no word wrong. It's just one incident. She didn't comment. She didn't share anything. Danielle put the phone down. She knows one thing for sure. If the truth only exists on social media, it will be swallowed up. She needs somewhere else. Danielle took a quick shower. She put on a simple outfit, a white shirt, dark pants, not to impress, but to remind myself who I am. She sat down at her small desk. She opened her laptop. This time she opened a different folder. Not a financial report. Not a contract. It's an assessment report. Westbridge Group. Danielle had been following Westbridge Group for almost a year. Quiet. Unhurried. She doesn't believe in quick wins deals. She believes in understanding the system before touching it. And this system has many blind spots. She opened a note file. The file names are very simple. Operational risks, internal. The list appears, asterisk. Complaints settled quietly, asterisk. Repeated crew misconduct reports, asterisk. High turnover in ground staff, asterisk. Culture issues flagged, not addressed. Danielle looked at the last line. Culture issues flagged, not addressed. She let out a soft sigh. What happened on Westbridge Air Flight 417 was not an isolated incident. It is an expression, and that reaction occurred with the very person who was considering buying them. Danielle closed her laptop. She held the phone. This time she didn't call Marcus Reed. She called another number. Some of these are qualities that very few people in the industry possess. The bell rang once, twice, then a deep male voice rang out. Danielle? No need for greetings. No need for introductions. Danielle smiled softly. Good morning, Thomas, she said. Thomas Avery, acting chairman of the board of directors of Westbridge Group. I wasn't expecting your call this early, Thomas Noy. Everything all right? Danielle was silent for a second. It was long enough for Thomas to realize this wasn't just a polite call. I was removed from one of your planes last night, Danielle Noe, by your crew, under the label of security risk. There was no immediate response from the other end of the line. Danielle heard the chair move slightly, a slow breath. I see, Thomas said, his voice lower. Which flight? Westbridge Air 417, Danielle replied. Chicago to San Francisco. A longer silence followed. Danielle didn't fill it. She let Thomas draw his own conclusions. Danielle, he said finally, I'm very sorry to hear that. Danielle tilted her head. I'm not calling for an apology, no. I'm calling because I want you to understand something. Thomas remained silent. I have the recording, Danielle tiptoed. I have documentation, and I was not disruptive. I was not uncooperative. She stopped. But more importantly, Konoi Chum Ray, I was treated exactly the way your internal reports suggest your culture operates. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Danielle heard the sound of papers being turned. Perhaps he was opening a file. Or perhaps he was recalling warnings he had read before. Danielle, Thomas Noe, are you saying this incident changes your position on the acquisition? Danielle looked out the window. The Chicago sky had begun to brighten. No, she said. It clarifies it. That answer left Thomas speechless for a long time. Finally, he said, what would you like me to do? Danielle didn't answer immediately. It's not because she doesn't know. It's because she wants to say it the right way. I want transparency, Konoi. I want access to the full incident report. I want to know how often this happens. And I want to know what's been done about it. Thomas nodded, even though she couldn't see him. You'll have it, Noi. I'll personally make sure of it. Danielle exhaled. Thank you, she said. Then she added another sentence. And Thomas, please do not notify the crew involved. Not yet. Thomas stopped. Why not, he asked. Danielle closed her eyes for a moment. Because, she said, her voice very calm, I want to see how people behave when they believe they are right. The call has ended. Danielle put the phone down. She felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. It just felt like a door had been opened. Danielle turned back to her laptop. Open your email. My inbox is fuller than it was early this morning. An email from the internal legal department, one from the communications team, and an email from Marcus Reed. Video is gaining traction. Media may reach out. Danielle read it. She didn't rush to reply. She watched the recording again. Not for legal analysis. Just to remember the feeling of sitting in seat 2A. The feeling of being stared at like a problem that needs to be dealt with. Danielle doesn't want to forget that. Not to harbor anger, but to maintain accuracy. She closed her laptop. Look at the clock. 7:30 a.m. The Westbridge Group Board meeting will take place at 9:00 a.m. Danielle stood up. She knew that once she entered that room, no one would know what had happened to her last night. And she also knew she wouldn't tell. Not yet. Danielle put on her jacket. Before leaving the room, she turned back to look at it one last time. The place where she doubted herself. The place where she stood between two choices. And the place she chose will not remain silent any longer. At an altitude of 35,000 feet, everything on the ground looked tiny. Cities are reduced to clusters of light. Roads are mere blurs. And stories seem to have no consequences. The first-class cabin of Westbridge Air 417 is now back to normal. The curtains were drawn shut. The engine hummed steadily. The lights dimmed, as if nothing had ever happened. Emily Carter stood in the small galley at the front of the compartment. She poured herself some coffee, adjusted her scarf, took a deep breath. Everything has been handled. The disruptive passenger has left. The flight departed on time. There were no emergency reports. By all internal standards, this was a successful handling of the situation. Good job back there, Richard Halverson said, as he stepped out of the cockpit. He took a glass of water. His voice was softer than it had been on the ground. Thanks, Captain, Emily replied. She smiled, a slightly strained smile. Richard nodded. Sometimes you just have to be firm on Noe. Otherwise, they think they can push. Emily nodded reflexively. They always do, she said. The remark came out so naturally. Neither of them realized what it meant. Seat 2A, where Danielle Brooks used to sit, is now occupied by someone else, a younger man. Wearing a gray hoodie, noise-canceling headphones, he placed his feet on the footrest and took a sip of champagne. Life goes on. In seat 1C, the man in the dark suit was scrolling through his phone. He frowned, not because of financial news, but because of a video. In the economy class section at the back, a young passenger is leaning close to the screen. He whispered to the person next to him, "Hey, isn't that the woman from earlier?" The other person leaned over to look. "Which one?" "The one who got escorted off." The video is slightly shaky. The faces aren't clear, but the voices are distinct enough. A deep male voice. If you do not comply, you may be removed. A calm female voice. On what grounds? The title runs below passenger, labeled security risk for asking questions. View count 120000, then 200000, then 350000. Emily didn't know that. She's busy preparing snacks, arranging trays, thinking about her next shift. But a strange feeling had emerged. It felt like someone was watching me from behind. Richard Halverson returned to the driver's seat. He adjusted his headphones. He looked at the control panel. Co-pilot Daniel Wu glanced over. "Captain," he said, his voice hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" Richard didn't come back. "Go ahead." "That passenger earlier, Daniel Noy. Did we ever check her boarding pass?" Richard frowned. "We didn't need to dap. Crew flagged it." Daniel was silent for a second. "Okay," he said. But a question had just been posed in his mind. In first class, an elderly woman called Emily over. "Excuse me, Ba Noy. Can you tell me your name?" Emily smiled. "It's Emily." The woman nodded. "I saw what happened earlier, Ba Noy. And I just wanted to say, that didn't look good." Emily froze. "I'm sorry," she asked. The woman did not raise her voice. She did not make any accusations. He only spoke very slowly. That woman didn't seem dangerous. She seemed calm. Emily swallowed. "Ma'am," she said, "we follow procedure." The woman looked at her for a moment. "Procedures don't always mean the right thing to do," she said, then turned away. Emily stood still. 1 second, 2 seconds, then she went back to work, but her hand trembled slightly. In the back seat, another passenger was live streaming. Not first class, but the camera angle is clear. He whispered, "They kicked her off, and now this is blowing up." Comments are scrolling by. Asterisk. "That's messed up." Asterisk. "Why is she a security risk?" Asterisk. "Airlines always do this." In the cockpit, a ping sounded. Internal messaging system. Richard glanced quickly. An announcement from the operations center. Social media activity increasing around Flight 417. Monitor. Richard frowned. "Daniel," he said, "pull up the cabin feed." Daniel complied. The screen displayed an image of the first-class cabin. Everything looks normal. No shouting, no fighting. Only those who sit still. Richard exhaled. "Probably nothing," he said. But he didn't turn off the screen. Emily went back to the kitchen. She opened her personal phone, specifying message inspection, but the app automatically opened a video. She recognized her own voice immediately. "I need you to step out of this seat." Emily's heart sank. She took off her earphones. She could hear better. She listened to her own voice. She listened to the way she emphasized the words. She heard the other woman's voice. "Calm down. Be clear. It doesn't sound like a problem." View counts continue to rise. Comments continued to pour in. Emily read a line. "She sounds more reasonable than the crew." Another line. "This is exactly how they treat black women." Emily turned off the screen. She said to herself, "They don't know the whole story." But another voice in my head asked again, "Do I know the whole story?" Richard received an internal call. From the operations center. Captain Halvorsen, the voice on the other end of the line, said, "We're getting press inquiries." Richard clenched his jaw. "So soon?" he asked. "Yes," the voice replied. "Someone identified the passenger." Richard stood up straight. "Identified how?" A moment of silence. "She's a CEO, Jeong Kia-noi. Danielle Brooks. Brooks Integrated Systems." The atmosphere in the cockpit changed completely. Richard said nothing. Daniel Wu looked at him. "Captain," he asked softly. Richard raised his hand. "Give me a minute." In first class, Emily leaned against the wall. She turned her phone back on. She searched for that name. Danielle Brooks. The image appeared. A black woman. Calm gaze, dark vest. Conference stage in the background. Title: CEO, Danielle Brooks, on ethical leadership. Emily felt a chill in her stomach. She remembered how Danielle sat. The way she spoke. The way she asked questions. No begging, no challenges. It just refuses to disappear. Richard returned to the compartment. He walked more slowly. Emily saw him. Their eyes met. Nobody said anything, but they both understood. This story isn't over yet. At an altitude of 35,000 feet, the flight continued. But the feeling of it's all settled has disappeared. Instead, it was something else. Anxiety. And somewhere underground, Danielle Brooks is walking into a conference room where powerful people are about to learn that the truth doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs the right timing. The meeting room on the 18th floor of Westbridge Group has no windows. It's not because of a lack of space. It's because this place is designed to be distraction-free. Long conference table, dark leather chairs, neutral white lighting. Everything points to one thing. Here, it's all about decision. Danielle Brooks entered the meeting room precisely at 9 a.m., not too soon, not too late. She wore a dark gray suit. Simple, no flashy jewelry. No one in the room stood up, not because of disrespect, but because nobody knows how to react yet. Thomas Avery sat at the head of the table. He nodded as Danielle entered. "Good morning, Danielle," he said. "Good morning," Danielle replied. Her voice was calm, as if nothing had happened last night. The other members of the board looked at her. Some had met Danielle before. Others only knew her through her profile. But this morning they were looking at her differently. No longer a potential partner. Instead, a variable. Thomas cleared his throat. "Before we begin, Ong Noi, I want to address an incident that occurred last night." The whole room fell silent. Danielle did not change her position. "Danielle," Thomas took. "I understand you were involved in an incident on Flight 417. Danielle nodded. "Yes," she said. "No additions, no subtractions." Thomas looked around the table. "We've received preliminary reports, Ong Noi, and external attention." Some people in the room shifted slightly in their chairs. Danielle placed both hands on the table. She didn't initiate the conversation. She let them speak first. One council member, Karen Mitchell, spoke up. "Danielle," she said, her voice cautious, "we're concerned about how this might affect the acquisition." Danielle turned to her grandmother. "Are you concerned about the optics, Ko-Hoi, or the behavior?" Karen paused. The atmosphere in the room changed. Thomas looked at Danielle. "That's a fair question," he said. Danielle nodded. "Last night, Danielle Noi, I was labeled a security risk for asking why my seat was being reassigned." She spoke slowly, clearly. "I was calm. I was seated. I was cooperative. No unnecessary emotions." Another person, Michael Grant, chimed in. "Danielle, Ong Noi, airlines have procedures. Sometimes misunderstandings happen." Danielle looked at him. "Michael no, a misunderstanding is corrected with clarification, not escalation." Thomas raised his hand. "Let's keep this constructive," he said. Danielle nodded. "That's exactly what I'm trying to do, Kodap." Thomas gestured to his assistant. The large screen at the back of the room lit up. "Danielle has provided us with a recording, Ong Noi. We're going to listen to a short excerpt." Several people in the room sat up straight. The sound rang out, voiced by Richard Halverson. "If you do not comply, you may be removed." Danielle's voice. On what grounds? Richard's voice. Non-compliance and potential security risk. Nobody said anything. The sound stopped. The room was completely silent. Danielle wasn't looking at the screen. She looked at each person in the room. "Before anyone explains this away, Ko-Noi, I want to ask something." She stopped. "How many of you, Danielle Tiaptuk, would have been labeled a security risk for asking that same question?" No one answered. Danielle took a shallow breath. "This isn't about one flight, Ko-Noi. This is about pattern recognition." She looked at Thomas. "You had internal reports, Ko-Noi. Culture issues flagged, not addressed." Thomas nodded very slowly. Karen Mitchell frowned. "Danielle Noi, are you suggesting this is systemic?" Danielle looked at her. "I'm saying it's predictable," she replied. Another member whispered something. Thomas raised his hand. "Enough, Ong Noi. Danielle, what are you asking from us?" Danielle didn't answer immediately. She took out her phone. "Place it on the table. I'm asking you, Ko-Noi, to decide who you want to be when this goes public." The words fell onto the table like a heavy object. Michael Grant exhaled. "Are you threatening us?" he asked. Danielle shook her head. "No," she said. "I'm informing you." Danielle leaned forward. "I don't want a personal apology," she said, this time in a lower voice. "I want accountability." Thomas sat up straight. "What does accountability look like to you, Ong Hoi?" Danielle looked at him. "Transparency, Ko-Noi. Immediate internal review. Suspension of the crew involved pending investigation." and a public statement that acknowledges harm. Karen shook her head slightly. That could cause panic, she said. Danielle Quay sang. Silence causes rot, she replied. A long silence followed. Everyone in the room understood. There are no smooth options. Thomas looked at Danielle. Danielle, he said slowly, if we do this, there will be consequences. Danielle nodded. Yes, she said. There always are. She stood up, not because she was impatient, but because she had said everything she needed to say. I didn't come here to demand victory, Danielle said. I came because I believe companies don't just buy assets. She looked around. They inherit behavior. Danielle put her phone away. Whether I proceed with this acquisition, Kono, depends on what you do next. She wasn't threatening. She wasn't exaggerating. Just tell the truth. Danielle walked out of the room. The door closed behind them. Inside, no one spoke for a few seconds. Karen Mitchell was the first to break the silence. She's serious, she said. Thomas nodded. Yes, he said. And she's right. At an altitude of 35,000 feet, Westbridge Air Flight 417 continued its flight. But on the 18th floor of a windowless building, a decision was taking shape. Quiet, undramatic, but it is irreversible. Westbridge Air Flight 417 has begun its stable flight phase. The lights in the first-class cabin were dimmed. A few passengers had reclined their seats and closed their eyes. The engine hummed steadily, almost lulling them to sleep. On the surface, everything looks perfectly normal. But beneath that calm surface, another current is silently spreading. Emily Carter stood in the galley area in front of the cabin, holding the service list. She had read this list twice, not because she needed to, but because her mind wasn't there anymore. The name Danielle Brooks kept repeating in her head. Emily remembers that moment very clearly. The way that woman looked directly at the captain. Not challenging, not afraid. It's just, they refused to back down. Emily encountered many difficult passengers. Some yelled, some threatened to sue, some tried to bribe her. But Danielle was different. Emily opened her phone again. She shouldn't, she knows it. But her hands continued working. The video has surpassed 2 million views. This time, the sound is clearer. Someone added subtitles. On what grounds? The text appeared in large letters. Emily swallowed. A new notification appeared. Westbridge Group internal memo expected. Emily frowned. Internal memo. She had never seen that word appear while flying. In the cockpit, Richard Halverson was no longer as comfortable as he used to be. He received 3 internal calls within 20 minutes. No one complained, no one raised their voice. But the voice on the other end of the line was different. Captain Halverson. A voice boomed from the control center upon landing. Please remain available for a brief debrief. Richard clenched his jaw. Debrief about what he asked. A very brief silence. An incident review, the voice said. Richard did not answer. He looked ahead. The sky was clear. The flight path was smooth. But deep down, something was slipping out of its familiar place. He turned to Daniel Wu, the co-pilot. Daniel know you ever feel like a situation is bigger than it looked? Daniel glanced at him. Yes and Noi. Usually after the fact. Richard nodded. In first class, a passenger called Emily over. Excuse me, Ta Noi. Is it true the woman who was removed is some kind of executive? Emily stopped dead in her tracks. I'm not at liberty to discuss that, she said reflexively. The man shrugged. Figures Noi. Seems like airlines only apologize when the wrong person gets hurt. Emily didn't answer. But that saying haunted her. About an hour later, an internal notification appeared on Emily's device. All cabin leads upon arrival report to Ground Operations Office immediately. Emily read it again. There is no reason, no explanation. It's just an order. She looked around the compartment. The passengers remained calm. No one knew. Emily felt her throat dry up. In the cockpit, Richard received the same message. Captain Halverson, report to Ground Operations Office upon landing. There is no please text. Richard leaned back in his chair. Daniel, he said, his voice low, I don't think this is routine. Daniel did not answer. He just looked straight ahead, his hands firmly on the controls. The flight began to descend. The seatbelt warning light comes on. The engine noise changes pitch. Emily walked along the compartment. her voice now sounding professional again. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Unbeknownst to anyone, she herself was also trying to maintain her balance. When the plane's wheels touched down on the runway, a few passengers applauded. Emily did not participate. She looked down at the floor. After the passengers left, Emily and Richard remained standing. He said nothing. They walked together down the airport corridor, but the distance between them was greater than ever. The ground operations office is located at the end of a less traffic hallway. Frosted glass door. No nameplate. Inside, the lights were on. Emily stopped at the door. She took a deep breath. "Captain," she whispered, "do you think we did something wrong?" Richard didn't answer immediately. He placed his hand on the doorknob. "Emily," he said, "we followed procedure." He said that as a matter of habit. But even he wasn't sure anymore. The door opened. There were no police inside. No shouting. There was only one man in a gray suit sitting at the table. Thomas Avery. Next to him was a young woman, her computer already on. Emily was stunned. Richard paused for half a second. Thomas stood up. "Thank you for coming, Ong Noi. Please have a seat." His voice was calm, not angry, not friendly. That is even scarier. Emily sat down, her hands clasped tightly together. Richard sat next to him. Thomas looked at them. "Before we begin, Ong Noi, I want to be clear." He paused. "This is not a disciplinary meeting." Yet, Emily felt her heart pounding. Thomas opened his laptop. Another screen pops up from the back. The image appeared. First class cabin. Seat 2A. Danielle Brooks' voice rang out. On what grounds? Emily closed her eyes. Thomas turned off the video. He looked directly at Richard. "Captain Halverson, Ong Noi, can you explain to me why this passenger was labeled a security risk?" Richard opened his mouth. Then closed it. Finally, he said. She refused to comply. Thomas tilted his head. "With what exactly?" Richard swallowed. "She refused to stand up." Thomas nodded, and standing up was required because... A moment of silence. Emily sensed the atmosphere in the room growing heavy. She wanted to say something. She wanted to explain. But every word began to sound empty. Thomas Quay saying, "Emily. Miss Carter, Ong Noi, what was your assessment of the passenger's behavior?" Emily sighed. She was calm, Ko Noi. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't threatening anyone. Thomas nodded. Then, "Why escalate?" he asked. Emily remained silent. She couldn't bring herself to say what she was thinking. It's impossible to say that. She felt that the woman didn't belong here. Thomas closed his laptop. "Here's why I asked you both here, Ong Noi. Danielle Brooks is not just a passenger." Richard looked up. Emily already knew. She is the lead negotiator for an acquisition Thomas Tip took, and she has provided documentation, recordings, witness accounts. He paused. "This incident is now under formal review." Emily felt her ears ringing. Formal review. Thomas stood up. "I suggest you both take the rest of the day off, Ong Noi. HR will be in touch. No blaming. No judgment. It's just a very long comma." When Emily and Richard left the room, the hallway remained quiet. But for them, things were different. Emily paused. "Captain," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "do you think she planned this?" Richard didn't come back. "No," he said. "I think she endured it." Elsewhere in the city, Danielle Brooks was sitting alone in her makeshift office. She looked at her watch. The flight has landed. She doesn't need an update. She knows. Danielle closed her laptop. She didn't smile. She didn't sigh in relief. She just sat there very still. Because she understood one thing. Once the truth has been invited into the room, it doesn't need to speak. It just needs to sit there. Westbridge Air's executive lounge is located on the top floor of the terminal. No big signs. Not crowded. There was only thick carpet, soft yellow lighting, and glass walls that offered a direct view of the runway. This place isn't for passengers. It's for those who are invited. Emily Carter stood in front of the mirror in the lounge's restroom. She adjusted her scarf, smoothed out the hem of her uniform. The mirror reflected a tired face, yet one still trying to maintain a neat appearance. Perhaps this is just an internal meeting, Emily told herself. An explanation. A reminder. She didn't dare think any further. Outside, Richard Halverson stood looking through the glass. The planes lined up. Thin wisps of smoke dissipated into the air. 30 years of flying, 30 years of adhering to procedures. He never thought he would be standing here in this state. A ground staff member appeared. Captain Halverson, Miss Carter Konoy, please come with me. A polite tone. No emotion. Emily and Richard followed. The doors to the VIP meeting room opened. Inside, it wasn't what they imagined. No champagne, no flowers. There was just one long table, a few leather chairs, and a large screen hanging on the wall. Thomas Avery was there. He stood beside the table, his hand resting lightly on the wooden surface. He was standing next to two strangers. A man in a dark suit, wearing glasses with an expressionless face. A younger woman, her hands resting on a laptop. Emily felt her heart skip a beat. Richard paused for a moment. Good afternoon, Thomas Noy. Please have a seat. No smiles, no handshakes. They sat down. No one said anything for a few seconds. The air conditioner hummed softly. Thomas spoke first. I want to thank you both for coming on, Noy. This meeting is to conclude our internal review. Emily clenched her fists. Internal review. Thomas looked directly at Richard. Captain Halverson on Noy. Do you stand by your decision to label the passenger a security risk? Richard swallowed. Yes, on Noy. At the time, based on the information provided. Thomas nodded. Information provided by whom? Richard turned to Emily. Then turned back. By the lead flight attendant, he replied. Thomas Quay saying, Emily. Miss Carter on Hoey, do you stand by your assessment? Emily opened her mouth. Then, stop. In her mind, the image of Danielle Brooks flashed before her eyes. The voice was calm. The question was simple. She wasn't aggressive, Emily Noyke. She didn't raise her voice. Thomas nodded. But you escalated, he said. Why? Emily remained silent. She couldn't articulate what had led her astray. It's impossible to say that. She felt the woman wasn't suitable. Thomas turned to the man wearing glasses. Mr. Lewis, he said, please summarize. The man stood up. Based on recordings, witness statements, and protocol review, Noy the passenger posed no security threat. Emily closed her eyes. Furthermore, Tip took the escalation violated company guidelines regarding de-escalation and bias mitigation. Bias mitigation. The word rang out very clearly. Richard jumped up. Are you saying this was discrimination, Hoey? Thomas looked at him. I'm saying, Thomas Dapp, that intent is less relevant than impact. The rear screen lit up. The video appeared. The moment Danielle stood up. The moment Richard pointed. The moment Emily asked to step out. No editing. No commentary. That's just the truth. Thomas turned off the screen. Miss Brooks declined to attend this meeting, Noy. But she authorized us to proceed. Emily looked up. Authorized, she asked, her voice trembling. Thomas nodded. She believes this should not be about her, Noy. It should be about us. The air in the room turned cold. Thomas opened an envelope. Captain Halverson Noy, effective immediately. You are suspended pending final determination. Richard was speechless. Suspended, he repeated. Thomas looked at him. You filed a report alleging noncompliance and security risk, Noy. The evidence contradicts that report. Richard sat down. His shoulders slumped completely. Thomas Quay saying, Emily. Miss Carter Noy, you are also suspended pending review. Emily felt her ears ringing. Suspended? Is this permanent, she asked. Thomas shook his head. That will depend, Noy, on your cooperation and understanding. Emily bowed her head. For the first time, she felt a very clear emotion. There's no need to be afraid. But it's embarrassment. Thomas stood up. This is not a punishment, Noy. This is accountability. He looked at both of them. And this is just the beginning. When Emily and Richard left the room, the lounge remained quiet. No one looked. There was no whispering. But the feeling is heavier than ever. Emily stopped in the hallway. Captain, she whispered, she could have destroyed us. Richard looked straight ahead. She didn't know Noy. She let us do it ourselves. Elsewhere in the city, Danielle Brooks was sitting in a small conference room. Marcus Reed sat opposite. Thomas just confirmed Marcus Noy. They suspended them. Danielle nodded. Neither happy nor sad. Do you want to make a statement, Marcus Hoy? Danielle thought for a second. No, she said. Not yet. She looked out the window. Let them speak first. Danielle stood up. She put on her coat. Marcus Konoe, make sure the acquisition team knows. Marcus nodded. Knows what he asked. Danielle turned around. That this company, she said slowly, is being tested. She left the room. There were no stage lights, no microphones, but somewhere a story is spreading. This isn't a story about someone being kicked off a plane. Rather, it's a story about a system forced to look in the mirror. The press conference room was much smaller than the media had imagined. No large podium, no giant logo in the background, no harsh lighting. It was just a room with just enough light, a few rows of chairs, and a microphone on a table. Danielle Brooks entered very quietly. No applause, no noise. But when she sat down, the room automatically fell silent. Danielle looked around. She recognized familiar faces. Economic journalists, social reporters. Some had followed her career for years. She also saw new faces. People who came because of the video, because of the controversy, because of a headline. Danielle doesn't discriminate. She knew. They were all listening. Marcus Reed sat in the back, his eyes focused. Thomas Avery was not present. Westbridge Group also did not send a representative. This is not a company meeting. These are the words of a human being. Danielle placed her hand on the microphone. No adjustments, no sound testing. She took a deep breath. Then he spoke. I'm not here to tell a shocking story, Danielle said, her voice low and clear. I'm here because so many people have lived through stories exactly like this, but were never asked. No one interrupted. A few days ago, she continued, I was removed from a flight for asking a question. She stopped. A reasonable question. A calm question. A journalist raised their hand. Miss Brooks, he asked, do you feel you've been discriminated against? Danielle looked at him. She didn't answer immediately. I feel, she said slowly, that when someone has to prove they are not dangerous simply because they don't fit someone else's image, it's no longer a personal matter. She paused. That's a systemic problem. A few keyboard clicks could be heard. Another reporter asked, why didn't she react immediately? Why didn't she raise her voice? Why didn't she strongly protest? Danielle smiled very slightly. Because, she said, black women have spoken out too many times and been labeled aggressive. She looked straight ahead. This time, I chose not to play by that script. The room fell into a deeper silence. Danielle, a veteran reporter, asked, you're the CEO. You have power. What do you think of people who don't have a position like yours? That question isn't easy. Danielle nodded. That's why I'm here, she said. I'm not speaking for anyone. But I don't accept the idea that respect only comes when you have a title. She paused. Dignity should not be a privilege. A young journalist asked, are you planning to sue the airline? Danielle shook her head. I'm not looking for punishment, she said. I'm looking for change. What changes? Someone asked. Danielle leaned forward. Change the way we react when someone says, this isn't okay, she continued. Don't ask if they have the right to speak. Ask, why should they speak? A long silence. Not unpleasant, not stressful. It's more like thinking. Danielle continued. I'm not angry at the individuals involved, she said. Anger is very energy-consuming. She looked down for a second. I'm more interested in what they've been taught is normal. A reporter asked quietly, do you forgive them? Danielle looked up. I'm not in a position to dispense forgiveness, she said. But I believe in accountability. She placed both hands on the table. We don't need more empty apologies, she said. We need systems that listen before escalating. The atmosphere in the room calmed down. An economic journalist asked, did this influence your investment decision in Westbridge Group? Danielle looked straight ahead. It influences how I invest, she replied. Not just the numbers, but the people. She stopped. Because when you buy a company, Danielle said, you're not just buying assets. You're buying ingrained habits. A few people nodded. Danielle looked at her watch. She knew the press conference was about to end. She concluded with a sentence. I don't want anyone to have to be a special case to be treated kindly, she said. I want kindness to be the default. She stood up. No bowing, no waving, just stand. When Danielle left the room, the journalists remained seated for a few seconds. It's not because we've run out of questions, but because they don't want to break that feeling. Outside, the media started running the news. No sensationalism, no incitement. The title that appears, CEO Danielle Brooks' Dignity, should not be a privilege. On social media, other stories began to emerge. Asterisk. A young flight attendant recounts the time she was taught how to read passengers. Asterisk. One passenger shared their feeling of being viewed as a nuisance. Asterisk. One pilot spoke about the pressure to maintain order at all costs. No one screamed, but something moved. At home, Danielle sat alone in the living room. She took off her shoes. She sat down on the sofa. No more cameras. No more microphones. All that remains is a very real exhaustion. Marcus Reed walked in. "You did a great job," he said. Danielle shook her head. "I'm just telling the truth," she replied. She closed her eyes. For the first time in days, her shoulders relaxed. "There's going to be a lot of work tomorrow," Marcus said. Danielle smiled. "I know," she said. "But tonight, I want to be a normal person." She stood up and went out onto the balcony. The city lights up. Small lights, small people. Danielle looked down. She didn't see herself as being on a high pedestal. She found herself in the middle. The top floor meeting room at Westbridge Group has windows. Unlike the meeting room on the 18th floor, here light floods in. The city stretches out below like a living map. But nobody in the room was admiring the view. Danielle Brooks sat at the far end of the table. Not the most powerful position, nor the central position. It's just the position she chose. Thomas Avery sat opposite. The board members surrounded him. Their faces were tired. Their eyes were wary. These past few days have been long enough. Thomas spoke first. "Danielle," he said, "we've reviewed the entire merger proposal." Danielle nodded. He said nothing. "Before we get to the numbers," Thomas continued, "we'd like to hear your final opinion." One council member frowned. Again, she whispered. Danielle heard it, but she didn't react. Danielle placed both hands on the table. "My opinion hasn't changed," she said, "but my decision has." A few people looked up. Thomas leaned forward. "Could you explain that more clearly?" he asked. Danielle took a deep breath. "I'm not backing out of this deal," she said, "but I'm not going to proceed with it the old way." The atmosphere in the room became tense. "Does she want to renegotiate?" one member asked. Danielle shook her head. "No," she said, "I want to restructure." A sound of a chair being moved echoed. Thomas remained silent, gesturing for Danielle to continue. "If Brooks Integrated Systems becomes a strategic shareholder," Danielle said, "we would request independent oversight of staff training, complaint handling, and cultural risk assessment." One person chuckled softly. "Do you want to control how we operate?" he asked. Danielle Quay sang. "I want to ensure," she said, "that the system doesn't react with power when it should be reacting with listening." Thomas frowned. "Danielle," he said, "that's a huge change." Danielle nodded. "Yes," she said, "and that's why I'm here." Another member spoke up. "She's asking us to admit that we have a problem." Danielle looked at the person. "No," she replied. "I'm suggesting you take the initiative to fix it before you're forced to." Nobody laughed. Thomas looked down at the stack of documents in front of him. "Do you know," he said slowly, "what precedent this will set?" Danielle looked straight ahead. "I hope so," she said. A long silence. Light shone through the glass, casting shadows on the meeting table. Thomas looked up. "If we agree," he said, "what will you commit to?" Danielle didn't hesitate. "I am committed to a long-term investment," she said. "Not just capital, but time and responsibility." One council member frowned. "Aren't you afraid this will damage your image?" he asked. Danielle smiled very slightly. "I don't build images," she replied. "I build standards." Thomas leaned back. He looked at each person in the room. Then go back to Danielle. "Danielle," he said, "you know you're asking us to change the way power operates." Danielle nodded. "That's right," she said, "because power doesn't correct itself." One council member sighed. "We need to vote," she said. Thomas nodded. "The tickets have been distributed." Nobody spoke. There was only the rustling of paper and the clicking of a pen. Danielle didn't look. She looked out the window. She recalled the moment on the plane. It wasn't humiliation. It was a feeling of being misdefined. Thomas collected the ballots. He counted. No expression. Then he put the ballot down. "The proposal has been approved," he said. "No applause. No cheering. It's just a decision." Danielle turned around. She didn't smile. Just a nod. "Danielle," Thomas said, "we'll need you to lead this process." Danielle looked at him. "I'm not going to lead alone," she said. I'm going to build a system where no one has to be like me to be heard. The meeting has ended. No one stopped to engage in small talk. Each person left with their own thoughts. Long corridor. White lights. Danielle walked slowly. Marcus Reed walked beside them. She just did something that many people avoid their whole lives, he said. Danielle smiled softly. I just stopped avoiding it, she replied. Are you tired? Marcus asked. Danielle thought for a moment. Yes, she said, but it's the kind of exhaustion when you know you're not hiding. Elsewhere, Emily Carter sat alone in her small apartment. She reads the news, not a sensational headline, but it's a small line. Westbridge Group announces Independent Cultural Oversight Initiative. Emily read it again, then read it again. She doesn't know if she'll ever go back to work. But for the first time, she thought about that night, not just with fear. Instead, it's through questions. What have I been taught? In another city, Richard Halverson sat in an empty office. The flight documents are still hanging on the wall. He looked in the mirror. He no longer presents the image of a confident commander, but it was a man who was reconsidering. Meanwhile, Danielle Brooks was standing on the office balcony. Whiffle. She didn't feel victorious. She felt like she was in the right place. The phone vibrates. A message from Marcus. Tomorrow will be loud. Danielle looked at the screen. Then answer. Then tonight let it be quiet. She turned off the lights. Closed the door. Stepping into the darkness was very peaceful. Some changes don't create a dramatic effect. They didn't shake the market overnight. They didn't make the breaking news headlines. They didn't get anyone to stand up and applaud. But they stayed. 3 months after the incident on Westbridge Air Flight 417, things on the outside seemed to have calmed down. No more viral videos. No more heated debates on social media. But within the system, a new flow has begun. A new training course is being held at Westbridge Air's training center. It's not about wine-serving skills. It's not about handling difficult passengers. But it was a lesson with a very simple tidal power and reflexes. Emily Carter was seated in the second row. She was no longer wearing her flight uniform, just a white shirt and dark trousers. She doesn't know where her career future is headed. But today, she came. The instructor is not a traditional lecturer, an independent expert recommended by Brooks Integrated Systems. No rhetoric, no criticism, just ask a question. What happens inside your body, the instructor asked, when you feel someone doesn't belong here? Emily took notes. Her hands trembled slightly. Reflexes aren't a sin, the person continued. But if you don't recognize them, they'll become actions. Emily looked up. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was on trial. She felt invited to think. In another city, Richard Halverson stood in a small warehouse. No more cockpit, no more control panel. All that's left are the shipping boxes and delivery schedules. His new job wasn't glamorous, but every evening he came home on time. Once he saw an airplane flying across the sky. He stood still for a long time. No bitterness, no resentment. It's just a belated admission. I confuse control with responsibility, he said to himself. And for the first time in years, he didn't try to make excuses. As for Danielle Brooks, she didn't become a daily face on television. She didn't write an autobiography right away. She didn't go around giving speeches everywhere. She returned to work. One morning, Danielle walked into the office early. She placed an empty chair in the large meeting room. No name, no title. It's just a chair. Marcus Reed walked in. What's that chair for? He asked. Danielle looked at the chair. To remind us, she said, that there's always someone who isn't present, but is still affected by our decisions. Marcus nodded. That chair was never used, but no one dares to forget it. A year later, Westbridge Group released its internal report, not for showing off achievements, but to acknowledge it. We misunderstood the concept of safety, the report stated. Safety doesn't come from eliminating people who bother you. Safety comes from understanding why you feel that way. The report wasn't shocking, but many other companies started reading. A young flight attendant sent an email to Danielle. I've never met her before, but for the first time, I'm not afraid to ask questions. Danielle finished reading. She didn't answer immediately. She saved the email. A passenger sent a handwritten letter. I used to think I was invisible. Now I know I'm not alone. Danielle carefully folded the letter. She didn't keep those things to show off. She kept them to remember why. During an internal year-end meeting, a new member asked Danielle, "What was the hardest part of it?" Danielle thought for a moment. Then, he spoke. "It's not about being treated wrongly," she replied. "It's about not becoming the person you hate when you have the power to retaliate." The room was silent. No one objected. Danielle stood up and walked to the window. The city is still noisy. People are still in a hurry. Not everyone changes, but some do. Danielle turned around. "I don't want this story to be remembered as an incident," she said. "I want it to be remembered as a moment when someone chose to stop." And if you're listening here, you've probably been in a moment like that before. On a flight, in a meeting room, or in a very ordinary conversation. Perhaps you were silent at times. Perhaps you have spoken up before. There are no easy choices. Danielle Brooks' story isn't about a flight. It's a story about how people react when confronted with power and prejudice. The biggest lesson isn't about who's right or wrong. It lies in a very real-life question. When you have power, whether small or large, will you use it to impose your will or to listen? Danielle didn't win because she was rich. She didn't win because of her CEO title. She won because she didn't lose herself in the moment of being insulted. For older viewers, this story can evoke many memories, times when you kept quiet to avoid trouble, times when you were misunderstood, but lacked the strength to explain, times when you chose to remain silent, thinking, "Oh well, it's okay." The story doesn't say that silence is wrong. It simply gently reminds us that your dignity doesn't depend on whether others recognize it or not. And sometimes change doesn't require shouting. It needs someone calm enough to say, "This isn't okay." And I'm going to stand by that fact. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the end. If this story gave you a new perspective, please like to support, share to spread the word, and post to continue following along. Because the most impactful stories often don't need to be told loudly.